When you think about summons, it's hard not to think about Bahamut. Known as the Conqueror of the Skies or the Dragon King, Bahamut has exuded power, elegance and grace in each of its many appearances. And due to the sheer spectacle often afforded to players via powerful moves like Mega Flare or dominant performances as part of the wider narrative, it's rare that Bahamut has failed to leave a lasting impression. This has created an enduring legacy that has now spanned over 35 years. But one of the most important aspects has been the steady progress of evolution. Since first appearing in association with the franchise back in 1987, Bahamut has had many different guises. It has become known as a summon of great power, but Bahamut has not always been a friend. And it's why we're excited to explore this particular topic in our typical granular style. Now, we know you love Final Fantasy summons, it's why you're here. For that reason, we'd like to share with you an exciting new project that we at Final Fantasy Union are working on. A brand new book called The Guardians of the Crystal. Over 3 years ago, we successfully crowdfunded a book called The Legacy of the Crystal. It chronicled the Final Fantasy franchise from the original game all the way through to Final Fantasy VII, The First Soldier, covering 135 games associated with the franchise. For our next project, we're doing the same, but with summons. The book will contain information on 88 different summonable beings, exploring what made them unique and their individual footprints from their first summonable appearance through to their last. These words will then be complemented by some fantastic pieces of key art, as artists from around the world have reimagined these iconic summons. If this project sounds of interest, The Guardians of the Crystal is live right now on Kickstarter, and you can find links in the description below. But for now, let's sit back and relax as we explore the complete evolution of Bahamut. When initial work was underway on the original Final Fantasy, numerous entertainment and fantasy properties were used as inspiration. Hironobu Sakaguchi, who had been wanting to make a role-playing game for some time, had a fondness for games such as Wizardry and Ultima. But Akitoshi Kawazu, who was the brains behind the game's underlying mechanics, had always been impressed by Dungeons and Dragons. Having such incredible properties to draw from was very useful throughout development, and many aspects were borrowed and reworked. The bestiary serves as a venerable who's who when looking through the bestiaries of those 3 previous properties. But one of the more prominent elements did not come via the bestiary. They came through the narrative and the faithful inclusion of a non-playable character called Bahamut. The inspirations were clear. As had been the case within Dungeons and Dragons, Bahamut was classified in Final Fantasy as the King of the Dragons. He could be found in the Cardia Islands, deep within the Dragon Caves, and should the party deliver a key item called the Rat Tail, Bahamut promised to provide assistance by enhancing their abilities. This therefore encouraged the party to fight their own battles, as opposed to relying on the strength of Bahamut directly. And with his assistance, the party was then able to defeat Tiamat, who within the lore of Dungeons and Dragons was classified as a nemesis of Bahamut. It meant each aspect felt purposeful, even if they were sometimes tenuous. The only aspect that was somewhat unexpected was the colour of Bahamut. In previous properties, Bahamut had almost always been described as having platinum scales, but in the original version of Final Fantasy on the Famicom, Bahamut was yellowy orange. Bahamut was then absent in Final Fantasy II before returning in Final Fantasy III. But instead of being very derivative of the Bahamut seen in other fantasy-based IP, the development team fleshed everything out to create a more original interpretation of the being. In the basic sense, Bahamut was still a dragon, and much like in the original game, he featured a garish yellowy-orange overworld sprite. But that was where the similarities ended between the 2 different iterations. In Final Fantasy III, Bahamut transitioned from being a benevolent being who aided the party to one that antagonized the party. In the initial sense, this resulted in an unwinnable, mandatory boss fight taking place against Bahamut on the top of a mountain, the very antithesis of the previous game where Bahamut was encountered deep within a cave. In battle, Bahamut sported an appearance that was more befitting of the Platinum Dragon found within the fantasy properties that served as inspiration, and he utilised a new ability called Mega Flare, which dealt incredible levels of non-elemental damage. Following the conclusion of this duel, which the player was required to lose, Bahamut retreated to his lair, a cave located southwest of Viking's Cove, and it was here that the party could challenge Bahamut in an optional battle. If defeated, Bahamut deviated further from established lore, as instead of watching from afar, he chose to aid the party directly. And in this regard, Bahamut represented the highest tier of summon magic available to the player. Depending on the job that initiated the summon sequence, Bahamut could perform one of three moves: Aura, Rend, or Mega Flare, with the latter move performing significant amounts of non-elemental damage. Final Fantasy IV carried forward much of what was added in Final Fantasy III, but after two strong showings, the narrative role of Bahamut was now diminished. In the original game, Bahamut had been there to guide the party and act as a pillar of strength. That role was now fulfilled by Leviathan, who appeared as the king of the Eidolons in the Feymarch. Bahamut was instead given a grander position, God of the Eidolons. But due to its relative standing, Bahamut did not reside in the Feymarch with the other summonable beings. Instead, it lived on the Red Moon in the Lair of the Father, also known as the Cave of Bahamut, representing the third game in a row where Bahamut could be found dwelling in a cave. It was here that Bahamut awaited the challenge of a warrior capable of rising to the heavens, but thus far, none who had sought the challenge had passed the test. The optional encounter also only became available should the party have already defeated Asura and Leviathan, and this codified Leviathan's status as being lesser than Bahamut in the pecking order of summons. The encounter itself featured a very similar looking sprite for Bahamut, alongside a new, much more aggressive one. But the colour scheme was now different. This saw Bahamut have a lighter underbelly with much darker scales that positioned it as a blue chromatic dragon. Bahamut then used Mega Flare to test and tease would-be challengers, and should the party then come through the encounter unscathed, they gained access to the highest tier of summoning magic available, as Rydia was able to summon Bahamut to use the power of Mega Flare on adversaries who she just didn't like very much. In addition to regular Bahamut, which was of course quite fearsome in its own right, Final Fantasy IV also introduced a new concept though: strains of Bahamut. Deep within the lunar subterrane, players could stumble upon Dark Bahamut. Unlike its cousin, this variant strayed away from the new platinum colour scheme to subtly revert back to the original appearance of Bahamut, as Dark Bahamut had its scales featuring very fiery tones, including orange. Should this party then overcome this even more challenging optional encounter against a Bahamut, then they were rewarded in kind. Ragnarok, Cecil's ultimate weapon, awaited the victor. Final Fantasy V continued to diminish the narrative importance of Bahamut, as this time the role played by the Venerable Summon was almost non-existent. Whereas each previous game had involved Bahamut in the game's lore somehow, either directly or indirectly, in Final Fantasy V, it was just deemed a powerful entity and no specific context was provided. The only thing that could be deduced was that a prior civilization deemed Bahamut to be a threat and sealed it away. To access Bahamut, players were therefore required to use the tablet obtained within the Pyramid of Moor to break the seal that was containing Bahamut. After being freed from its prison, Bahamut then chose to settle atop the North Mountain, a purposeful throwback to Final Fantasy III. Should the party venture to the top, they could then challenge Bahamut as an optional encounter, and when they did, a noticeable difference was seen. Never before had a black dragon appeared within the entire franchise, and although it could have been coincidental, the ominous appearance of Bahamut in Final Fantasy V had parallel to the portrayals of black dragons as antagonists within Dungeons and Dragons. Should Bahamut be bested though, summoners gained access to Mega Flare. But unlike the two prior games, even though Bahamut was within the highest tier of summon magic, this was not a unique quality anymore, as Leviathan and Phoenix were both raised to feature within the same tier. Final Fantasy VI featured a narrative that was centered around espers. They were magical beings created during the War of the Triad, and in the midst of the War of the Magi, they created a new realm where they could live in peace. But even though numerous espers feature within the narratives such as Valley Garmander, Ramuh and Maduin, the role of Bahamut was relegated to nothing more than a cameo. Unlike every prior installment, this meant Bahamut no longer had a physical presence. Up until this point in the franchise, it had been common for Bahamut to appear as an NPC or optional boss, and only if defeated would he then grant the power of Mega Flare. This concept remained, but the notion regressed, as the optional fight was no longer against Bahamut himself. It was instead against Death Gaze, a challenging enemy that needed to be hunted down numerous times. Only if the party were successful in this endeavour would they then acquire the Bahamut Magicite. When summoned, Bahamut would cast Mega Flare, one of the most powerful offensive attacks performed by an Esper, but it was no longer top tier, as its power was eclipsed by not just Crusader, but also Valley Garmander and Alexander. During the summoning sequence, as had been the case in Final Fantasy IV, players then saw Bahamut was positioned as a chromatic dragon instead of platinum, with a black tone instead of blue. It also had menacing red eyes. Final Fantasy VII continued the notion of summons being stored within an object, but instead of magicite, this time the object was materia. Orbs of materia could be found throughout the world, and amongst the numerous types available, summoned materia were some of the rarest. Due to this device, Bahamut again had no physical presence, nor did it have any role in the story. The method of acquisition also regressed further. In Final Fantasy VI, Bahamut was gatekept by Deathgaze, a pseudo-superboss, offered to players as a reward for overcoming the challenge. This time, players also had to overcome a boss, the Red Dragon inside the Temple of the Ancients, but it was nowhere near as challenging. Even if the challenge was not as great, there was an interesting and purposeful association though, as within the lore of Dungeons and Dragons, Red Dragons were aligned with the darker toned dragons. And in Final Fantasy VII, Bahamut was black, just like in Final Fantasy V. When summoned, Bahamut used Mega Flare, and its utility evolved as it now ignored magic defense, but its relative power was further diminished compared to the rest of the summonable roster, and it was no longer amongst the strongest available to the player. This felt like a huge regression, but there was at least some kind of evolution to counterbalance this. Instead of there being only one strain of Bahamut, Final Fantasy VII built upon what had been seen within Final Fantasy IV to introduce two new strains of Bahamut. In addition to Bahamut, this meant we also saw Neo Bahamut and Bahamut Zero. Unlike the regular Bahamut, each of these could simply be found and picked up, but they were at least still missable. Neo Bahamut, for example, could be found lying on the ground in the Whirlwind Maze. When summoned, players then bore witness to a Crimson Red Bahamut, as well as an upgraded ability called Giga Flare. This retained all the hallmarks of the new, evolved version of Mega Flare, but dealt more damage, making it a superior ability. But it paled in comparison to the power of Bahamut Zero, which could be obtained through two methods, but neither involved any direct conflict. The preferred route was to interact with the blue, huge materia after acquiring Bahamut and Neo Bahamut. But should this route be blocked, the Bahamut Zero materia could be dug up from Bone Village. When summoned, Bahamut Zero continued the chromatic colour alignment, but its power was immense, and Terra Flare, another upgraded version of Mega Flare, was only outclassed by Knights of the Round in terms of strength, and this classed Bahamut Zero as a top-tier summon. Both Bahamut and Bahamut Zero then appeared in Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII as summonable beings that dealt non-elemental damage, but for some reason Neo Bahamut was not included in the roster. Not long after the release of Final Fantasy VII, the first major franchise spin-off was launched in Japan. It featured a whole new setting and saw Final Fantasy delve into a new subgenre, but many of the classic elements were retained. This saw, amongst other things, summoners appear as one of the available jobs, and they could call upon many established summons to aid the party. Bahamut was amongst the roster, but we again saw a regression with regards to method of acquisition. Instead of being fought or found, Bahamut now needed to be learnt. This diminished the challenge that had almost always been associated with obtaining Bahamut, with Neo Bahamut being the only prior exception. But there was still a challenge, it just came in a different form. That was because Bahamut was by far the most expensive summon to learn, costing 1,600 GP, which was 600 more than the next highest. The challenge was therefore related to patience. After being learnt, players gained access to a powerful summon, but it was not the most powerful, nor was it even second. The top spot was taken by Zodiac, which dwarfed the power of all other summons due to the nature of its acquisition, but in second spot was Cyclops, with Bahamut appearing in third. Following hot on the heels of Final Fantasy Tactics was another spin-off called Chocobo's Mysterious Dungeon. Various summons featured as magicite crystals that could be used to aid the Chocobo on its quest, and one of them was Bahamut. Amongst the roster, Bahamut was the most expensive and most powerful summon available, and it was the only one that did not deal damage associated with a specific element. This made Bahamut a very valuable ally. Its design, in keeping with the aesthetic of the wider game, was also softened. This meant Bahamut was still dark-toned, but the body was now purple with bright yellow talons. The role of Bahamut was then enhanced in the sequel, Chocobo's Dungeon 2, as Bahamut was made into an NPC who was there to guide and assist the Chocobo outside of in-game application. This then served as a nice reference, as Bahamut introduced himself as the King of Dragons, a moniker not seen since the original Final Fantasy. Beyond this, Bahamut was also available as a regular summon and a feather summon. The former saw Bahamut deal a classic pre-rendered FMV sequence followed by damage, but the latter represented a big evolution. By using the Bahamut feather, it replaced the current partner with Bahamut. This then meant Bahamut joined the player as they walked around dungeons. Chocobo's Dungeon 2 also featured Dark Bahamut as a generic dragon-type monster, but it was not the most powerful, and that mantle was taken up by the Red Dragon. Given the relationship between Bahamut and the Red Dragon in Final Fantasy VII, this may have also been a purposeful connection. Final Fantasy VI and VII saw much deviation in terms of how Bahamut was represented as a summonable being, but Final Fantasy VIII served as a mini-revival, as many of the established characteristics returned. Bahamut was positioned as an optional boss that could be found hidden within the Deep Sea Research Center. Not only was this location a throwback to earlier games when Bahamut would often be found within a cave, but Bahamut also had some lore. Esther had been conducting some of their darkest work into the Guardian Force phenomenon at this specific location, and as the research team delved deeper, they started to uncover things that should have been left well alone. Following the defeat of Sorceress Adele, the outpost was sealed off. Security protections were installed, and the site was all but abandoned and kept hidden from public knowledge. This then served as a loose allusion back to Final Fantasy V, when Bahamut had also been sealed away. Upon breaking the seal and entering the research center, players then had their virtue questioned. The right to challenge Bahamut, who had a dark, chromatic color palette, only then happened if he deemed their answers satisfactory. Should the party be successful and Bahamut be bested, they then gained access to Mega Flare, a move that denoted Bahamut as the second strongest Guardian Force, only bested by Eden. And like in Final Fantasy VII, this non-elemental move ignored magic damage. The other important aspect relating to Bahamut came from the opposition side. Tiamat served as a minion of Ultimecia found within her castle, standing in opposition to Bahamut and his chosen allies. Final Fantasy IX saw the revival of Bahamut continue. For the first time since Final Fantasy III, this saw Bahamut as an active participant within the story. This time, Bahamut was denoted as a powerful eidolon that was being controlled by Kuja, and this forced him into the role of antagonist once again. Bahamut was first used to destroy the Alexandrian fleet and kill Queen Bran, before then being forced to attack Alexandria itself. This time, however, Bahamut was thwarted by Alexander, and this served as a probably coincidental reference back to Final Fantasy VI, where Bahamut was supplanted by Alexander in the pecking order of summoned strength. Tiamat also appeared during the story as a guardian of terror, and as a weaker manifestation of an Eidolon. But the most important aspect here was that the alignment with Terra placed Tiamat on the opposite side of Bahamut, who was an Eidolon of Gaia. Now, it was possible for Garnet to use Bahamut towards the start of the game, but the huge MP cost was very prohibitive. It was only later, once Garnet's powers had awoken, that Bahamut could be relearnt from a piece of Garnet. But as these were easy to obtain, it again took the challenge out of acquiring the summon. It was perhaps for this reason that even though Bahamut was strong, and was Garnet's most powerful regular Eidolon, it was not the strongest. That moniker was instead granted to Arc, a secret Terran Eidolon, as its internal darkness ability surpassed that of Megaflare. There was a difference, however, in that Arc was an elemental Eidolon, whereas Bahamut was not. When Bahamut then featured, at the behest of Garnet, its appearance loosely mirrored the weakest strain seen in Final Fantasy VII. This meant Bahamut had a black body with tanned torso and purple wings, but this time the colour of the wings was much more prominent. As Final Fantasy VI had done years prior with Espers, Final Fantasy X featured a narrative that revolved around Aeons. They appeared as physical realizations of the Faith's dreams and could communicate with summoners who prayed to them within the Chamber of the Faith. Numerous Aeons appeared in this fashion, but the one who had the biggest impact on the narrative was Bahamut. For the second time in the franchise, this saw Bahamut assist the party by providing useful information. And this had a direct impact on Tidus, who after learning the truth of his existence from Bahamut, was motivated to defeat Yu Yevon, even though he knew it would come at a great personal cost. Due to this central role, Bahamut was a mandatory acquisition, but there was again no challenging encounter present as a barrier to this acquisition. Bahamut could be fought, however, numerous times in fact, but only when summoned by another character. During these encounters, players got to bear witness to a new visual design, as alongside a chromatic colour theme, Bahamut now had rainbow-embellished wings. After the acquisition, Bahamut also performed Mega Flare when called upon, and for the first time this move broke the damage limit innately. But even though Bahamut was the strongest storyline Aeon, it wasn't top tier. Anima, the Mega Sisters and Yojimbo provided more firepower and more utility. Final Fantasy X also saw a variant appear in the form of Dark Bahamut. This could be faced in the international version in the Zanakan Dome, and it needed to be defeated in order to gain access to the fight against Penance. Dark Bahamut then appeared in Final Fantasy X-2, faced in the Bevelle Underground as a mandatory encounter. Final Fantasy XI did not feature summons within its initial outing, but as expansion packs started to release, they became prominent parts of the experience. Called avatars, they were positioned as magical beings and were classified into various groupings. There were the sleeping gods, who were known as the celestial avatars, and the 5 terrestrial avatars, who were born of Vana'diel and were tasked with protecting the 5 mother crystals. Bahamut fell into the second category, and he came to prominence within the storyline of Chains of Promathia. This saw a significant return to roots, as for only the third time, Bahamut was designated as the King of Dragons, or the Worm King. In this role, Bahamut served as a pseudo-antagonist. As a terrestrial avatar, Bahamut wanted to protect Vana'diel no matter the cost. And due to a pact made with Celtius, this saw Bahamut attempt to destroy humanity, as he believed that this was the quickest route to achieving that objective. Above all else, Bahamut and some of the other terrestrial avatars feared the arrival of the Keeper of the Apocalypse, known as Promathia. But they believed that if humanity was destroyed, there would be no reason for Promathia to return. Thus, Vana'diel would be saved. Bahamut continued with this folly despite pleas from his old allies and new heroes. But even after Promathia was defeated, Bahamut still remained unconvinced that humanity was strong enough to survive future calamities and returned to challenge them again as both a storyline boss and an optional boss. In these fights, Bahamut used various abilities including Mega Flare, Giga Flare, and Terra Flare. This was the first time a single strain of Bahamut had access to all 3 iterations of its iconic move. And it was also the first time that these moves were aligned to an element, as they each dealt fire damage as opposed to being non-elemental. As of the making of this video, Bahamut remains unavailable for summoning by players adopting the summoner role, and this then positioned Bahamut as a loose homage to the original Final Fantasy, where it existed as part of the narrative, but not as a summonable asset. The other point of note came from the visual aesthetic. This time Bahamut had dull purple scales with a tan body, and this felt reminiscent of Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon, albeit with a far more aggressive and serious tone. Final Fantasy XII chose to use its unique Ivalice espers instead of those that had featured in a prominent fashion throughout the rest of the franchise, and this meant Bahamut did not feature in a direct capacity. But there were some key allusions. The Arcadian Empire named airships after prominent summons, and Sky Fortress Bahamut was the flagship of the Imperial fleet. And as the story came to a dramatic conclusion, we also got to see a further allusion. Vayne Solidor was confronted atop the Sky Fortress, where he merged with Vanar to become the Undying, a draconic being. This served as a clear reference to the Sky Fortress's namesake, and to make the reference even clearer, the Undying made use of Mega Flare and Terra Flare, while also using a sword attack named Giga Flare Sword. Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings had no need for illusions, as Bahamut appeared as a non-elemental rank 3 flying esper, and it featured in prominent fashion throughout. During the story, Bahamut was summoned by not only the Judge of Wings, but also the game's final boss, Fail Thanos Exultant. Not only did this make each encounter threatening and perilous, but each time players got to bear witness to a majestic visual interpretation of Bahamut. Every prior iteration had represented Bahamut as a powerful draconic being with thick scales, but this time Bahamut was geared for war. Alongside white platinum armour, this saw Bahamut also wield a huge spear, and in another twist, it was also the first instance of Bahamut having green skin. The other major adjustment came from the challenge of acquisition. In earlier Final Fantasy games, there was often some kind of gauntlet set down to the player if they wanted to obtain Bahamut. This time though, Revenant Wings ended up featuring a literal gauntlet, as players needed to defeat numerous rank 3 espers including Ifrit, Shiva, Ramuh and Titan before Bahamut then appeared. After winning, Bahamut could then be bought from the Ring of Pacts. As a rank 3 esper itself, Bahamut was not the strongest in the game, but was amongst the strongest. Its ultimate ability was Mega Flare, but alongside dealing high levels of damage, it also had the chance of inflicting the Disable status on all susceptible targets. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII then continued the notion of evolving Bahamut, but it also paid tribute to the past. An iteration of Bahamut based on the weakest summon materia strain from the original game could be fought numerous times as the game progressed. But the more interesting aspect came from a brand new strain of Bahamut called Bahamut Fury. Much like Neo and Zero, Bahamut Fury was quite distinctive, but this time things were amped up. As soon as Fury was summoned by Genesis during an encounter in the Shinra building, players bore witness to a gold-plated Bahamut that was colossal in size. This then built upon what was seen in Revenant Wings, as Bahamut was geared for war again, and its armour featured numerous embellishments that improved its combat efficiency. During this encounter, Fury also built upon the previous strains to introduce a new ability called Exaflare. This dealt non-elemental damage, but its ancillary qualities differed. When fought, Exaflare reduced Zack's MP and AP to 0, but when summoned as part of the digital mindwave system, Exaflare ignored an enemy's spirit stat, just like the previous Bahamut moves ignored magic defense in the original Final Fantasy VII. The notion of challenge was also retained. Bahamut Fury had to be defeated 3 times, once during the story and 2 via optional missions, and only then was it made available in the digital mindwave. The last version was also by far the toughest, featuring more than 5 times the HP, much higher attributes, and also extra abilities. Bahamut next surfaced in Final Fantasy Fables' Chocobo's Dungeon, and this brought forth a faithful reference to the original Chocobo's dungeon games. This meant Bahamut had his purple skin, yellow talons, and softer design, quite the contrast to Revenant wings. However, its role was somewhat in between the original Mysteries dungeon and its sequel, as Bahamut was fought as a boss numerous times as opposed to being a helpful ally. Bahamut could also be obtained as a summonable magicite though, after considerable challenge it should be noted, and its application was nearly identical to the original game as it dealt heavy elemental damage to all enemies within the area of effect. In the next major Chocobo game, dubbed Chocobo and the Magic Picture Book, The Witch, the Girl and the Five Heroes, we then saw something pretty significant. Every iteration of Bahamut thus far had been draconic. We'd seen different colours of skin, and sometimes Bahamut had even worn armour and used a weapon, but the same base had always been present. This time, however, Bahamut was positioned as a human. In this guise, Bahamut wore a black outfit and was given a role in the story as an NPC. And much like some prior Bahamuts, this iteration also served as an ally, coming to the aid of the Chocobo when it needed it most. Now, by this point in the franchise, fans had wanted there to be a Final Fantasy game that pulled characters from various universes into a single entity. Dissidia Final Fantasy ended up being that property. Protagonists and antagonists from the original Final Fantasy through to Final Fantasy XII were represented, and they were supported in combat by a huge array of summons. Bahamut was amongst the roster, and two distinct versions featured that paid direct tribute to the past. The first, the automatic variant, was summoned when a specific criteria was met. This was based on Final Fantasy X. The second, the manual variant, was then based on the Final Fantasy III iteration. Both had the same application, casting aura on the summoner to increase their bravery points over a specific period of time. The same application was then carried forward to its sequel, Dissidia Duodecim, but this time there was also a major difference. As Yuna had been added to the playable cast, her main gameplay application related to summons, and she was able to call forth a literal manifestation of Bahamut from Final Fantasy X. And this did more than cast positive status effects, as it could use the same abilities as in Final Fantasy X, including Mega Flare. Now, each of the appearances of Bahamut after Final Fantasy XII progressed the summon in some way or paid a strong tribute to the past. Similar was expected within Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of Light, given its nature as something of a tribute game itself. But even though Bahamut did feature, it was perhaps the least compelling iteration ever seen. Bahamut was faced as a boss in the Moonsand Ruins, but it was just a reskin of a regular dragon, and beyond that, it contained nothing that tied it to any previous iteration of Bahamut outside of it just having the same name, as its abilities were even generic. The same sentiment could then be applied to the appearance of Bahamut in Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, the Crystal Bearers. In the first half of the story, Amida Telion, aka Goldenrod, summoned Bahamut as a way of thwarting Lael and showing their power. This positioned Bahamut in a similar vein to the wider franchise, as it was still a summonable draconic being, but it only appeared as a boss. After being defeated in this encounter, Bahamut was never seen again in the rest of the game, outside of it appearing on Lael's jacket. It was not until Final Fantasy XIII that we saw a return for the venerable, powerful, and intimidating Bahamut. It featured alongside a suite of old and new Eidolons, and although Bahamut was not given a speaking role, it was ingrained in the narrative. Each member of the playable cast had an Eidolon that they were associated with. This was bestowed by the goddess Etro, who tasked each Eidolon with challenging their chosen Nasi during a time of great emotional strife. Bahamut was assigned to Fang, and it appeared before her as they ventured through the 5th arc. It was here that Fang's emotional moment came forth, as after listening to Snow's battle cry, she turned to the party, as she'd rather them die by her hand rather than suffering the fate of turning into a Seath when they failed their focus. It was at this moment that Bahamut appeared as a mandatory storyline boss, and what players saw was a combination of different elements. This saw Bahamut wear armour that was black in colour with purple accents. After then overcoming the challenge, Fang could call upon Bahamut as an ally in battle to damage enemies through powerful non-elemental attacks, and its Gestalt mode finisher was Mega Flare. Whereas Final Fantasy IV, the Four Heroes of Light, was designed to be a modern-day Final Fantasy game that embodied and refreshed old elements, Final Fantasy Dimensions was designed to be the very embodiment of the 8-bit and 16-bit era. Many prominent aspects from Final Fantasy games released during that time were brought forward, and amongst them were jobs and summons. With this in mind, it was fitting that Bahamut had an important role to play that mirrored many of those earlier iterations. As the game progressed, Bahamut could be faced at the Mountain of the Father, just like in Final Fantasy III and V. But unlike those earlier games, Bahamut now had purple skin with a tan body and bright blue accents on its wings. This showed that Dimensions was as much about paying tribute to the past as it was about creating something new and unique. Bahamut's abilities also embodied this philosophy, as alongside Mega Flare, it also had numerous other abilities such as Tri-Breath, Flare, and Devil Claw. After overcoming the encounter, players then gained access to Bahamut as a summonable being, and this saw Bahamut return to a place it hadn't been for a very long time, as it was the most powerful Eidolon available to the party. In the original iteration of Final Fantasy XIV, the appearance of Bahamut then blew everything prior out of the window by providing the most comprehensive representation of the summon we had ever seen in relation to the franchise. Bahamut was denoted as one of the first brood, 7 great worms who were amongst the oldest living and most powerful beings on Hydaelyn. As time passed, these dragons often came into conflict with mortal races, and during the Third Astral Era, the place where Bahamut resided was attacked by the Allagan Empire. Bahamut fought well in the ensuing conflict, but was ultimately slain. This caused much distress to the other great worms, one of which was Tiamat. As had been the case in Dungeons & Dragons, Tiamat now appeared as Bahamut's sister, but they were no longer positioned as opposites. After learning of Bahamut's fate, Tiamat was manipulated by the Ascians into summoning a primal in the image of Bahamut. Unbeknownst to her though, the Ascians had taught the Allagan Empire a method through which this new Bahamut could be subdued and used. It saw Bahamut incarcerated within an artificial satellite called the Dalamond. On the surface, this seemed like a nice narrative device, but it was also a very purposeful reference back to earlier games such as Final Fantasy V and VIII, where Bahamut was sealed away. When Bahamut was then freed during the 6th Astral Era, he sought revenge against the realm and displayed clear antagonistic qualities. It resulted in a devastating assault that served as the climax of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0. As the conflict waged, Bahamut was defeated by Louisoix, but he wasn't slain. Players then had to wait until the release of Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn to see what happened next in that particular narrative arc. In Final Fantasy Type 0, Bahamut was aligned with the Vermilion Bird Crystal. Under this guise, it was one of the main weapons used by the Dominion of Rubrum as they sought to fend off the Militesi Empire. The use of Bahamut, though, was not without consequence. In Final Fantasy XIII, summons were tasked with challenging l'Cie, defeating them if they were not deemed up to the task. In Type 0, there also existed a relationship between the summon and the summoner, but this time the loss of life was unavoidable. Those who called forth a summon perished, and they were therefore used only as a last resort. Bahamut-class Eidolons were considered the most powerful amongst the regular, sitting below the verboten Eidolons, and such was the power they wielded that players were unable to even gain access to Bahamut-class Eidolons within a regular playthrough of the game. Instead, the first available Eidolon, called Bahamut, could only be unlocked after completing the Crimson Code mission Operation Volturnus on Officer difficulty, something only possible by playing through the game twice. This denoted a specific challenge in relation to acquiring Bahamut that was much greater than other Eidolons featured in the game. And that challenge only increased if the player wanted to access stronger variants. The basic Bahamut class Eidolon had access only to Mega Flare, but Giga Flare was associated with Neo Bahamut, which was only attainable on Agato difficulty. A third variant, Bahamut Zero, could also use Terra Flare, but this was only temporarily available to the party during a playthrough. Now, as Final Fantasy XIII 2 served as a sequel in the same vein as Final Fantasy X 2, the developers could have easily taken a similar approach and had Bahamut return in its original form, but they chose to take a very different approach. Instead of keeping Bahamut aligned with Fang, this meant it was instead realigned with the game's brand new antagonist, Caius Ballard. Due to his immense power, Caius was given the ability to fuse with Bahamut to create a brand new entity called Chaos Bahamut. This was similar to the regular form of Bahamut, but much darker in tone. As the game drew to its conclusion, Caius then split Chaos Bahamut into 3 individual entities: Jet Bahamut, Amber Bahamut, and Garnet Bahamut. Each had a colour palette that paid reference to a prior iteration of Bahamut, but of these, Jet Bahamut was the main focus. It was able to use Giga Flare, Terra Flare, and even Exa Flare, an ability only previously associated with Bahamut Fury, and it had almost 10 times more health than the lesser variants. Both Bahamut and Chaos Bahamut were then referenced throughout Lightning Returns in various capacities, most notably during the game's ending sequence. After the conclusion of Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, thoughts moved on to its relaunch as Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. And as Bahamut had been defeated but not slain, there always existed the possibility of it returning to rear its ugly head. As the storyline developed, players learned that after being defeated, Bahamut retreated to the binding coil of Bahamut. In the 7th Astral Era, it then attempted to regenerate its damaged body so that it could once again seek revenge against mortals. Players could then venture to the binding coil of Bahamut to take part in an optional raid, and after progressing to turn 4 of the final coil of Bahamut, Bahamut then appeared in all his glory to serve as the final boss of the binding coil storyline. During this encounter, Bahamut Prime used Mega Flare, Giga Flare, and Terra Flare, as well as numerous other moves, one of which was called Mega Flare Dive. Upon completing the final coil of Bahamut, much as had been the case in Final Fantasy XI, spoils were then granted in the form of equipment. But unlike that game, from this point forwards, summoners were able to call upon Demi-Bahamut to assist them in battle. Final Fantasy explorers positioned classic summons as beasts that needed to be hunted down and slain. Bahamut was found at the summit of Mount Chamonix, and this was a nod to some of the earlier iterations, but its design was far more extreme than many of the more natural appearances from the past. This saw Bahamut feature a huge tail with shades of purple throughout, but its wings were crystalline in nature. This then gave the venerable dragon a very different aesthetic. After defeating Bahamut, players did not gain access to a new summon, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, they gained access to the Bahamut Crystal Surge, which was Mega Flare. This dealt an apocalyptic blast of energy, but also rained down meteors. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 featured an expansive array of summons, with numerous unique entities and countless variants featured. Bahamut was amongst this roster, but we also got to see something unique, as Bahamut was also one of the main party members. This had never happened before, if we exclude the manga sequel to the original Final Fantasy, where Bahamut was one of the Warriors of Light. In Dimensions 2, Muti was an Idolord of the Eidolons and joined the party as a young Bahamut. Without getting too much into the weeds, everything ended up going full circle though, as alongside being one of the protagonists, Muti also ended up being encountered as a pseudo-antagonist as Bahamut, god of destruction from the future. Subsequent encounters served as an allusion back to Final Fantasy III, purposeful or otherwise, as whenever this version of Bahamut was encountered, it was impossible for the player to actually win, they just had to survive for a certain number of turns. Beyond that, Muti was also one of the main antagonists, as Bahamut became corrupted by Chaos and transformed into Chaos Bahamut. That wasn't all though. Bahamut was also available as a regular Eidolon for Morrow to use, but there were numerous other variants of Bahamut available, including Erd Bahamut, Verth Bahamut, and Skald Bahamut. Each of these variants was based on a Bahamut from the past, but they didn't necessarily relate to Final Fantasy. Bahamut, for example, was based on Final Fantasy X, while VIII Bahamut was based on Bahamut from Bahamut Lagoon, another role-playing game developed by Square that was actually directed by Kazushika Nojima, the writer famed for working on Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and X. Each variant also used a form of Giga Flare as their summon ability, with the distinction relating to their name. Bahamut, for example, used Giga Flare U. The final aspect of Bahamut then reared as the game reached its conclusion. Once Chaos Bahamut had been defeated, it only gave rise to the game's true antagonist, Neo Chaos Bahamut. The allusions here were very obvious, as the name itself drew from the original Final Fantasy's final boss, Chaos, and the final boss of Final Fantasy V, Neo Exdeath. And it further strengthened the association between Bahamut and final bosses that had been developing since Final Fantasy XII. Mobius Final Fantasy was another game that incorporated summons from across the franchise's illustrious past, but it also introduced an original variant too. Bahamut was featured in the game's second year, and it was through this card that we saw a seldom used trait re-emerge. Throughout the majority of its appearances, Bahamut had been non-elemental, but in Mobius, the default Bahamut card summon was associated with the fire element, using an ability called Flame Fury when called. The only previous time the same elemental affinity had been adopted was in Final Fantasy XI. Alongside regular Bahamut, Mobius also introduced Extreme Bahamut and Extreme Bahamut X. Both were visually based on the iteration that appeared in the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, and they were both aligned with the Dark element. Two other original variants were Bahamut Neo and Neo Bahamut. Both featured names that were identical to the summon that had previously appeared in Final Fantasy VII, but they were inspired by, as opposed to replicating. Bahamut Neo was a fire elemental, but Neo Bahamut was a light elemental. On top of this, there was also another Neo Bahamut, but this one was a direct reference back to Final Fantasy VII, and it was also a light elemental. This was joined by two other Final Fantasy VII inspired iterations, Bahamut Zero, another light elemental, and Bahamut, which was a dark elemental. There was also a Final Fantasy VIII inspired version and XIV inspired version, both of which were fire elementals. As Mobius was building out, so too was Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. It introduced Bahamut via an entire region called the Realm of the Dragon King, an optional region that was only accessible after Season 1 of the story had been finished. Slumbering within, players could then challenge Bahamut, an esper that had once been sealed away, just like in many of those earlier iterations in the franchise. After being freed, Bahamut then claimed this new realm, renaming it in his honour. He could be challenged at the Eternal Summit, another reference back to previous antagonistic Bahamuts who often dwelled at the peak of mountains. After being defeated, Bahamut could then be used as an esper by the party. A few years after the game released, Bahamut then reappeared as part of an event called Trial of the Dragon King. As if to evidence the power creep in the game, this version featured 17 times more HP and some seriously beefed up attributes. When it was first announced, Dissidia Arcade was seen by many to be the version of Dissidia they had always wanted. Instead of being isolated to portable devices, it had big budget and high production values. And it also proposed a team-based combat scenario, which worked in with the wider themes of party-based play. There were numerous perceived benefits to this approach, but one of them was an enhanced focus on summons. This time, only a finite number were selected, with teams able to vote on which they wanted to aid them in combat before a bout started. And amongst the finite roster was Bahamut. This iteration continued with the dark colour palette, with a purple hue also visible via armour plating. In combat, Bahamut used a few different moves, but Mega Flare served as its ultimate ability. When then challenged as a standalone boss, however, things changed. In this new arena, Bahamut was able to use Mega Flare, but also Giga Flare and Terra Flare. Each dealt massive HP damage, but the way they did so differed, and this made sure to keep players on their toes throughout the entire encounter. Bahamut next appeared in World of Final Fantasy, and we got to witness something expected, but also unexpected. With World of Final Fantasy serving as a tribute game with a twist, it was no surprise to see Bahamut appear. But this time we got to see Bahamut lean much harder into the role of antagonist, and there was a lot of emphasis placed on the character and its backstory. Throughout the narrative, we gained exposure to numerous villains, but the main antagonist was Brandelis, who was based on Bahamut, specifically from Final Fantasy X. This then manifested as the game came to a head, as players came face to face with X9 Bahamut. To make matters worse, upon the release of World of Final Fantasy Maxima, X9 Bahamut returned as the final superboss. This time it had two forms, was much stronger, had new abilities, and even different elemental weaknesses. On top of this, Bahamut, also known as Teobabilo, appeared as a character that was separate from Brandelis. This iteration was part of Pleiad 7, a group of traditional summons who fulfilled a critical role in the story. Under this guise, Bahamut was obtainable via the Prism system and was capable of using Mega Flare. Final Fantasy XV then continued the notion of giving Bahamut a comprehensive backstory, although its motivations were initially made more ambiguous. Bahamut served as the god of the Astrals, much as he had in Final Fantasy IV, and within the context of the game's lore, he had descended from a higher plane, existing in a realm beyond the physical, from which he oversaw and looked to guide the evolution of Eos. This saw Bahamut take on an active role in the story as he proceeded to influence everything that happened. But whether he can be called an antagonist is down to interpretation. Bahamut was ultimately there to support humanity. He gave them access to the crystal and provided guidance to Noctis when the time came for him to assume the role as the true king. But he also betrayed and manipulated Arden, becoming the source of his ire. When the time came, Bahamut also took an active stance in the conflict against Ifrit, appearing for the first time in the franchise as a one-time summon. Bahamut displayed its power by attacking with the Ultima Sword instead of Mega Flare, which was reserved for usage when destroying Arden's wall. Unlike the other Astrals, Bahamut could not be called on during other times of strife, and he did not appear as an optional or mandatory battle within the main campaign, something that had not happened in a mainline game since Final Fantasy IX. He did, though, appear as a mandatory boss in the game's multiplayer expansion, Comrades. Bahamut did not feature in Heavensward as much as in A Realm Reborn or even 1.0, but there was a notable return to form in Stormblood. Whereas A Realm Reborn introduced the Binding Coil of Bahamut, Stormblood introduced an ultimate raid called the Unending Coil of Bahamut. Unlike the previous challenging raids, the Unending Coil of Bahamut only consisted of a single encounter, but that encounter pitted players against 3 previous super bosses in a sequential encounter, and one of them was Bahamut Prime. Players also needed to fight Twintania and Nail at the same time, but that wasn't the end, as after defeating the duo, Golden Bahamut Prime appeared as a super boss. Similar to previous Maximum instances, such as Bahamut Fury and Jet Bahamut, this iteration of Bahamut was able to use Exaflare, but it also served as a nice allusion to Bahamut Fury, which was also golden. When Square Enix announced they were working on a remake of Final Fantasy VII, it raised numerous questions. Fans around the world were desperate to learn how the developers were going to modernize every single aspect of the game. And of course, that also included summons. In the original game, Bahamut had 3 unique strains, with the classic Bahamut considered as the weakest. But in the context of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, due to how the original was being spliced up, Bahamut was able to revert back to its original status before Final Fantasy VII. This positioned Bahamut as the most powerful summon materia available to players in the game, but first they had to undertake some legwork. Before Bahamut was even mentioned, players had to complete all 19 battle intel reports. They then had to beat Bahamut in a pretty grueling encounter. But that wasn't all. Bahamut also featured in the infamous Versus Shinra Secrets encounter that could be faced in the Shinra Combat Simulator on hard mode during Chapter 17. And what made it so tough was that Ifrit joined Bahamut. War of the Visions incorporated numerous aspects from Brave Exvius, but it also attempted to forge its own path by fusing with a very different genre. One thing it did retain, however, was espers, and the inclusion of Bahamut. Bahamut was introduced in the Japanese version of the game in November of 2020 as a powerful non-elemental being. At the time, it was the strongest esper in the game, with GameA even classifying it as one of the few double S tier espers due to its damage output and huge area of effect. But Bahamut was not the only variant to feature, as Dark Bahamut was added into the game in January 2023. Dark Bahamut featured a dark purple colour palette, and its stats were even greater, making it a very valuable commodity for those who were able to acquire it. Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin was positioned as a pseudo-sequel, pseudo-remake of the original game, and as Bahamut, as we highlighted at the beginning of this video, played quite an important role in the original game, fans expected there to be a reappearance. But they had to wait a very long time until the Trials of the Dragon King downloadable content to see Bahamut return in any kind of meaningful way. The narrative context was then very similar, but there was a key difference. Bahamut promised to help Jack and his allies to become true Warriors of Light, just like he did with the original Warriors of Light, but his aid was only given should Jack prove himself worthy, and nod to how things had developed within the franchise over time. In the build-up to Final Fantasy XVI, there was much speculation as to whether Bahamut would feature amongst the roster of icons. But as we got closer, it was revealed that Bahamut was indeed in the game, and his dominant was Dion Lesage. Much like Caius in Final Fantasy XIII too, this meant Dion was able to transform into the King of Dragons, and Dion, through Bahamut, was feared amongst the other dominants due to his incredible prowess in combat. This enabled the Holy Empire of Sanbreque to wage numerous wars, as Dion was always there to turn the tides and see them win out the day. With Bahamut given such a prominent role, there were quite a few adjustments seen. For one, Bahamut was now classified as a light elemental summon. Bahamut, through Dion, was also something of an unwilling antagonist, forced to play along with his father's wishes. In the end, Dion ended up losing control of himself, and it was only through the intervention of Clive that his anger was quelled. It was during this encounter, however, that we got to see something very new: Zeta Flare. This move had previously only been wielded famously by Donald Duck in Kingdom Hearts 3, but in the context of Final Fantasy, the most powerful iteration of Mega Flare previously associated with Bahamut was Exaflare. That all changed with Final Fantasy XVI, as towards the end of the battle, Bahamut attempted to destroy everything with the power of Zeta Flare. It was during this time that we also got to witness an allusion to Golden Bahamut. After the encounter, Clive then gained access to Bahamut's iconic powers. Amongst them was Mega Flare, but Giga Flare also appeared as the most expensive ability. That then brings us on to the most recent iteration of Bahamut, which appeared in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. As Bahamut had already appeared in Final Fantasy VII Remake, the developers opted to not bring it back for the sequel. They instead opted to modernize Neo Bahamut, renaming it to Bahamut Arisen. This could first be encountered in Chadley's VR simulator after reaching Cosmo Canyon, and it was described as the God of Destruction. Once defeated, players then gain access to Bahamut Arisen as an ally, and its ultimate ability was Giga Flare, just like in the original game. It stands to reason then that the third part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project will introduce an evolved version of Bahamut Zero. But as the franchise continues to evolve itself in other ways, it will be interesting to see which aspects of Bahamut future developers choose to adopt. Although it started out as a simple homage to Dungeons & Dragons, the Bahamut featured across the Final Fantasy franchise has grown to become something so much more. It has featured as a core component in many different narratives, both within the main series and numerous spin-offs. And Bahamut has also taken on the role of friend and foe, shifting to suit the various needs of each particular scenario. We've seen a variety of different strains of Bahamut introduced too. Each has come with their own colour palettes and their own evolution on that original Mega Flare ability. It means that even now, almost 40 years since the original Final Fantasy graced Famicom consoles in Japan, Bahamut remains one of the most recognisable and relevant figures to be associated with the franchise. and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. But as we've now reached the conclusion of this study, we'd ask you to tell us about which you feel is the ultimate iteration of Bahamut. And if you were interested in The Guardians of the Crystal, the book we mentioned at the top end of this video, which chronicles every single summon associated with the mainline games, including Bahamut, now would be a good time to check it out on Kickstarter. You can find a link in the description below. Also, if you found the video insightful, we'd very much appreciate any interactions you can offer in terms of liking the video, commenting and sharing it around to people who you think might enjoy watching it. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Christopher Milstead, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory, Endog Snake, Stephen and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.